Hi, we're continuing on with chapter 3. This is part 2 of that. And we're going to talk about conjunctive adverbs now. And conjunctive adverbs connect or join equal sentence elements, but they're used to transition from one thought to another. And sometimes they're more than one word. Sometimes they're called transitional expressions or transitional conjunctions. So you may hear those terms too. And here are some of the most common ones: hence, thus, then, that is, and then consequently, however, therefore, and moreover. And then here's some that are more than one word: in fact, and so on. Okay, we use semicolons before conjunctive adverbs that join independent clauses. Commas follow conjunctive adverbs of 2 or more syllables. Okay, our supply of toner is quite low. Well, here is an independent clause. And then we must reorder immediately. This is another independent clause. And therefore is 2 syllables. So we use a semicolon and then a comma after it. So we want to remember, if it's more than 2 syllables, if your conjunctive adverb is, then you use a comma after it. But you use a semicolon before it. Okay, first Deborah Holmes was to be honored. Well, here's an independent clause. Then Linda Holloway received an award. Okay, so these are 2 independent clauses. Our conjunctive adverb is only 1 syllable, so we don't need a comma here. We just use the semicolon here. Okay, some words that are function as conjunctive adverbs can serve as parenthetical or interrupting adverbs. Parenthetical. We use commas to set off parenthetical adverbs that interrupt the flow of a sentence. Okay, we are, therefore, re-examining all print and advertising. Now, we're not joining anything of equal value here because we have we are, which is a subject and a verb, re-examining all the print advertising. We could ignore this right here, this part, and have our sentence still make sense. So it's an interrupting part. It's just there for interest, or making your sentence sound more interesting. So we don't really need it there, so we could ignore it and read the sentence without it. So if we can do that, we want to put a comma before and after it. Okay, you may, on the contrary, prefer shopping online. Well, I could totally ignore this part right here, and I might say you may prefer shopping online. So this is an interrupter. It's not necessary, but it's there for interest. So we separate it with commas. Okay, so how can you tell the difference between conjunctive adverbs and parenthetical adverbs? Conjunctive adverbs join 2 clauses. Parenthetical adverbs appear within 1 clause. Okay, so like what I was showing you a little bit ago, leaving those parenthetical adverbs out, we still had 1 independent clause. They just interrupted the flow of it. Okay, let's try this. We're going to put some commas and semicolons where needed. Okay, Brandon made an excellent suggestion. However, the team did not give full approval. Okay, so we have Brandon made an excellent suggestion. Well, that's 1 independent clause. The team did not give full approval. Well, that's another independent clause. So what are we going to do with this? We're going to put a semicolon before it and a comma after it because it's more than 2 syllables. Okay, team members, however, did agree that Brandon should try his idea in a small trial. Okay, we have team members, however. Now, if we didn't say however, team members did agree that Brandon. So we have one independent clause there. So this is just kind of interrupting the flow of our sentence. So let's put a comma before and after it. Okay, reducing prices can increase customer interest. On the other hand, lower prices may not increase profits. Okay, we have reducing prices can increase customer interest. That's one independent clause. And then lower prices may not increase profits. Well, that's another independent clause. So what do we have here? On the other hand. Do we need that there? No. Well, actually, this is a conjunctive adverb, and it is joining two independent clauses together. It's more than two syllables, so we need to use a semicolon and a comma after it. First, we must produce quality products, then we must develop customer awareness. Okay, we must produce quality products. That's one independent clause. And then we have we must develop customer awareness. That's another independent clause. So we're going to use a conjunctive adverb here, which is then. We need to put our semicolon here, but do we need a comma? No, because it's only one syllable. So we just need our semicolon there. Last winter was very cold. In fact, it was the coldest winter on record. Okay, we have last winter was very cold. That's one independent clause. And it was the coldest winter on record. That's another independent clause. So we have in fact is being used as a conjunctive adverb. Since it's more than two syllables, we need our semicolon and our comma after it. Okay, we experienced consequently extremely high heating bills. We experienced is not an independent clause. Extremely high heating bills is not an independent clause, but altogether it is. We experienced extremely high heating bills. So consequently is a parenthetical expression. We set it off with commas because it's just kind of interrupting the flow of our sentence. It's not necessary. Okay, we're going to move on to level 2. We're going to talk about punctuating introductory and terminal dependent clauses, and then punctuate parenthetical, essential, and non-essential dependent clauses. That was a mouthful. Okay, first of all, we're going to talk about subordinating conjunctions. They join unequal sentence elements, such as a dependent clause joined to an independent clause. So remember before, if we had two independent clauses, we could join them with coordinating conjunctions, but these are ones that are not equal. So we're going to use these are called subordinating conjunctions. And here's some examples of some subordinating conjunctions. And these are all listed in your book as well. Okay, here we're going to look at some examples. Clauses, independent clauses have subject and verbs. Independent clauses have subjects and verbs. Independent clauses make sense by themselves. Independent clauses depend on other clauses for the completion of their meaning. Independent clauses can stand as simple sentences, and dependent clauses are often introduced by subordinating conjunctions. So let's take a peek at this. Unless we hear from you by today, no materials can be sent. Okay, does it stand on its own? Unless we hear from you by today? No. So this is a dependent clause. No materials can be sent. Is that a dependent or an independent clause? Well, this is an independent clause. I could start with this and put a period at the end and have a sentence that stands on its own. Okay, if you agree to these terms, that's not really an independent clause. It's a dependent clause because it can't stand on its own. But this part, please sign the contract, could stand alone as a sentence. I could capitalize please and have a sentence there. Okay, when you sign the agreement, is that an independent or a dependent? Well, it is dependent because it needs something else to help it make sense. We can begin the project is actually an independent clause. I could make that a capital W and have a sentence. Okay, we're going to talk about punctuating sentences with dependent clauses now. And dependent clauses can be introductory, terminal, or parenthetical. We've talked a little bit about parenthetical, so we're going to talk about these in more detail. Okay, introductory dependent clauses. We use a comma after a dependent clause or a subordinate clause that precedes an independent clause. For example, because Kim did well, well, here is our dependent or subordinate clause. She was offered a position. This is our independent clause because we could have that as a sentence all by itself. Well, this is before that. This dependent one is right before the independent one, so it's considered a subordinate clause or an introductory dependent clause because it's introducing. We would use a comma to separate them. After she left the interview, this is another dependent clause. Kim sent a thank you note is an independent clause. So this one can stand by itself, this clause, so we're going to separate them with a comma. We use a comma after an introductory dependent clause even though the subject and verb may not be stated. Okay, so here is our introductory dependent clause, if possible. Now this is an implied. It would be the subject and this would be the verb, and they're implied but they're not shown in the sentence. This is what they're saying. This is still a dependent clause, and this is our independent clause. Send me a text message. So we're going to use this comma after it because even though it's not in the original sentence, it's implied. So it's taking the place of our subject and verb. Okay, as expected, here's our subject, it, and our verb is. And this is a dependent clause. And then we are overwhelmed with work. This is an independent clause. It can stand on its own. So here we're going to separate it with a comma. Okay, terminal dependent clauses are at the end. When it falls at the end of a sentence, it doesn't need a comma. The dependent clause introduced by a subordinating conjunction does not require a comma when it falls at the end of a sentence. Okay, so here we have invoices must be verified. Well, this is an independent clause. I could put a period here and have a sentence. Okay, so here's our conjunction before, and we pay the bill isn't a dependent clause. It can't stand on its own. But since it's at the end, we do not need a comma here. So we need to remember that. If the independent clause comes first and the dependent clause falls at the end after a subordinating conjunction, then you do not need a comma. Kim was offered a position. Here's our independent clause. Here's our subordinating conjunction because she did well in the interview. This is our dependent clause, so we don't need a comma here since it's at the end. Okay, then parenthetical clauses are within sentences. Dependent parenthetical clauses that interrupt the flow and are unnecessary for the grammatical completeness of the sentence are set off by commas. We've kind of talked about this a little bit.